Most people believe respect is earned by giving more. They answer messages immediately, agree to every request, explain every decision, and make themselves endlessly available. They assume generosity automatically increases their value. What they fail to notice is that the human mind often separates kindness from scarcity. Something can be appreciated without being respected. In fact, the easier something is to access, the less carefully many people treat it. This does not mean you should become cold. It means you should become intentional. There is a significant psychological difference between being available and being accessible. Availability suggests that your time belongs to whoever asks first. Accessibility means people can reach you, but within boundaries that protect your priorities. Observe how people react when those boundaries first appear. Some adapt immediately. Others become irritated. The irritation itself is information. People who respected you all along usually respect your limits as well. People who benefited from your lack of limits often experience boundaries as a personal loss. They are not mourning the relationship. They are mourning unrestricted access. The human brain assigns value through multiple signals. One of the strongest is selectivity. When attention is directed carefully rather than indiscriminately, observers naturally assume it carries weight. This is why an endorsement from someone who rarely gives praise often feels more meaningful than dozens of compliments from someone who praises everyone equally. Frequency changes perceived value. Imagine two people giving advice. One offers opinions on every subject, regardless of expertise. The other speaks only after careful observation. Even before evaluating the content, most listeners instinctively attribute greater credibility to the second person. Restraint creates the expectation of substance. This principle extends beyond conversation. If you explain every choice before anyone questions it, you unintentionally communicate uncertainty. Confident people do not feel compelled to justify every action. They understand that not every observer requires complete access to their reasoning. Silence is often interpreted more carefully than excessive explanation. That does not mean silence is always wise. It means unnecessary explanation can reduce perceived confidence because it signals that external approval has become part of the decision-making process. Behavior communicates priorities. Priorities communicate value. Another common mistake is confusing generosity with self-abandonment. Helping others is admirable. Constantly sacrificing your own objectives to avoid disappointing people gradually teaches them that your commitments are negotiable. Notice how quickly expectations form. You answer instantly once, then twice, then 10 times. Soon, a delayed response becomes interpreted as unusual rather than normal. Patterns become standards. This is why deliberate consistency matters more than occasional intensity. People learn how to treat you by observing what you repeatedly allow. Every interaction quietly teaches others what access, attention, and behavior they can reasonably expect. If you continuously lower your standards to preserve approval, approval becomes increasingly expensive, while respect becomes increasingly rare. Respect grows where standards remain visible. Approval grows where standards disappear. These two outcomes are frequently mistaken for each other. Many individuals spend years collecting approval only to discover they are surrounded by people who enjoy their usefulness rather than admire their character. The distinction becomes obvious when circumstances change. If you stop giving, who remains? If you stop solving every problem, who still calls simply to hear your perspective? If your attention is no longer unlimited, who values the time you do choose to share? Those answers reveal the true structure of your relationships. Value is not created by convincing everyone you are important. It is created by consistently behaving as though your time, attention, and principles matter. People believe what they repeatedly observe. If you abandon your priorities whenever someone pressures you, observers unconsciously conclude that your priorities were never deeply important to begin with. Strong boundaries do something unexpected. They filter relationships. Some people leave because access becomes limited. Others become closer because mutual respect replaces convenience. Filtering is not failure. It is clarification. One of the quietest forms of confidence is refusing to compete for attention. The need to constantly prove intelligence, success, or significance usually communicates the opposite of what was intended. Secure individuals allow their actions to establish credibility over time. Results require fewer explanations than promises. This is why emotional composure often carries extraordinary influence. During uncertainty, most people instinctively watch the person who appears least controlled by emotion. Calmness becomes a signal, not because calm people know everything, but because emotional regulation suggests internal stability. Stability attracts trust. Trust attracts influence. Influence grows naturally when it is not desperately pursued. Ironically, the pursuit of status often undermines status itself. Individuals who constantly seek recognition reveal that recognition has become psychologically necessary. Observers detect dependence more quickly than most realize. Dependence reduces perceived authority. Freedom increases it. The paradox is that becoming expensive has very little to do with appearing exclusive. It has everything to do with demonstrating that your choices are guided by principles rather than pressure. When your schedule reflects your priorities, people notice. When your words consistently match your actions, people notice. When you decline opportunities that conflict with your values without apology or hostility, people notice. Not everyone will admire those decisions. They do not need to. Respect is rarely unanimous. Those who demand unlimited access often confuse cooperation with obligation. They assume closeness entitles them to immediate attention, emotional labor, or constant reassurance. Healthy relationships recognize that respect includes acknowledging another person's independent life. Every meaningful commitment requires saying no to something else. Time is finite. Attention is finite. Energy is finite. Because they are limited, they possess value. Spend them as though they matter. And over time, people begin responding accordingly, not because you demanded respect, but because your behavior consistently demonstrated self-respect first. There is a moment in almost every relationship when people stop listening to your words and begin studying your patterns. They may not realize it consciously, but the brain is constantly searching for consistency. It asks a simple question over and over again. What happens if I push here? Sometimes the push is harmless. Sometimes it is intentional. Either way, your response becomes part of the answer. If every request receives an immediate yes, people stop asking whether you are available. They begin assuming you are. The question disappears because the outcome has become predictable. Predictability is useful in systems. It is not always useful in social dynamics. The mind pays greater attention to what requires consideration than to what is guaranteed. This is one reason anticipation can be more psychologically engaging than immediate gratification. Effort increases cognitive investment. Waiting increases perceived significance. Selectivity creates curiosity. None of this requires manipulation. It requires awareness. Many people unintentionally remove all mystery from their lives by explaining every plan before it happens, revealing every emotion the moment they experience it, and responding to every notification as though it were urgent. Their internal world becomes completely available to anyone with enough persistence. When nothing is protected, nothing feels precious. Think about conversations with someone who speaks only to fill silence. After a while, individual words lose impact because they arrive without intention. Contrast that with someone who pauses, considers, and responds only after listening completely. Even if both communicate the same idea, the second person's words often carry more weight. Meaning is shaped not only by content but also by delivery. Restraint gives language room to breathe. This principle extends beyond speech. It influences attention, affection, availability, and even ambition. People often mistake constant visibility for influence. They believe being noticed everywhere automatically increases importance. Yet many of the most respected individuals are remembered not because they appeared constantly, but because each appearance carried substance. Consistency without overexposure creates credibility. Overexposure often creates familiarity. Familiarity can become comfort. Comfort, when unchecked, can slowly become complacency. Complacency changes the way people treat you. Notice what happens when someone believes your presence is guaranteed. Invitations become last minute. Gratitude becomes less frequent. Assumptions replace appreciation. Not because they consciously decided to disrespect you, because certainty changes perception. Scarcity is not merely about rarity. It is about intentional allocation. A person who values their attention distributes it according to priorities rather than pressure. This does not make them distant. It makes them deliberate. Deliberate choices signal internal order. Internal order inspires confidence in observers. There is another psychological tendency worth understanding. People naturally test what appears valuable. Employers test competence. Friends test loyalty. Negotiators test confidence. Even children test boundaries to understand where structure exists. Testing is information gathering. Your reaction teaches people what future interactions will look like. Suppose someone repeatedly interrupts you in conversation. The first interruption may be accidental. The second may still be coincidence. By the fifth or sixth occurrence, a pattern is developing. If you consistently surrender the floor without returning to your point, You communicate something without speaking. You communicate that your contribution can be displaced. Most communication occurs beneath awareness. Tone, posture, timing, and consistency often influence perception more than carefully selected phrases. This is why two people can deliver identical sentences and receive entirely different responses. The sentence is the same. The behavioral signals surrounding it are different. Confidence is often mistaken for loudness because loudness is easier to notice. Genuine confidence usually appears through steadiness. It resists the urge to dominate every conversation. It does not rush to defend itself against every misunderstanding. It recognizes that credibility accumulates through repeated demonstrations rather than repeated declarations. There is freedom in no longer feeling obligated to convince every observer. Not everyone will understand you. Not everyone needs to. Some people evaluate others through the lens of usefulness. Others evaluate them through the lens of character. If you spend your life trying to satisfy the first group, you may eventually neglect the qualities appreciated by the second. Utility changes with circumstance. Character remains visible over time. Another overlooked aspect of value is emotional predictability. This does not mean suppressing emotion. It means responding proportionately instead of impulsively. People feel safer around those whose reactions are stable. Stability reduces uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty increases trust. Trust is difficult to demand but relatively easy to cultivate through consistent behavior. Notice how quickly trust erodes when actions and words drift apart. A promise broken once may be forgiven. A pattern of broken promises reshapes expectations. Eventually, people stop believing future commitments because past behavior has become the stronger signal. The reverse is equally true. Quiet reliability often receives little attention in the beginning because it lacks drama. Over months and years, however, reliability compounds. People begin assigning greater weight to your words because experience has repeatedly confirmed them. Reputation is built in ordinary moments, not during speeches, not during celebrations, during the countless interactions that seem too small to matter. Those small moments are where value quietly accumulates. Every time you honor a commitment you could have ignored, every time you decline respectfully instead of agreeing resentfully, every time you choose honesty over convenience, every time your actions remain aligned with your principles despite immediate pressure. These decisions rarely produce instant admiration. They produce something far more durable. Predictable integrity. Predictable integrity is difficult to imitate because it requires sustained discipline rather than occasional performance. Eventually, people stop evaluating isolated incidents and begin expecting consistency. Expectation becomes reputation. Reputation becomes influence. Influence built on reputation tends to endure longer than influence built on image because image depends heavily on perception, while reputation is reinforced by lived experience. This is why protecting your standards matters even when no one appears to be watching. Habits practiced in private inevitably shape behavior in public. What people eventually respect is often the visible result of countless invisible decisions. The most valuable people in any environment are rarely those who seek importance at every public opportunity. More often, they are the ones whose presence consistently improves the quality of the environment itself. They reduce unnecessary conflict. They increase clarity. They make thoughtful decisions under pressure. They create confidence without demanding attention. That kind of value cannot be manufactured overnight. It is developed through repeated choices that place long-term credibility above short-term approval. And once people recognize that your standards remain steady regardless of convenience, many interactions begin to change. Not because you asked for different treatment, but because your behavior quietly redefined what access to your time, attention, and trust actually means. There is an invisible negotiation taking place in every interaction you have, and most people never realize it exists. It is not a negotiation about money, influence, or status. It is a negotiation about standards. Every conversation, every favor, every delayed response, every promise kept or broken, quietly answers one question. What is this person willing to accept? Human beings are remarkably adaptive. We learn from repetition much faster than from instruction. Someone can tell you they value honesty, but if they repeatedly tolerate dishonesty without consequence, observers begin trusting the behavior more than the words. Behavior is always the louder language. This is why people who constantly announce their worth often struggle to have it recognized. Their message and their behavior are moving in opposite directions. They say their time is valuable, yet they surrender it whenever someone applies enough pressure. They claim to respect themselves, yet repeatedly compromise their principles to avoid temporary discomfort. The contradiction becomes the story. Most people never consciously identify this inconsistency. They simply experience a subtle decline in confidence toward the person. Something feels misaligned. They cannot explain why, but their perception shifts. The brain is exceptionally sensitive to congruence. When words and actions reinforce one another, trust grows. When they compete with one another, uncertainty grows. Uncertainty weakens authority. This is why genuine confidence rarely requires constant reassurance. It is reinforced internally before it is recognized externally. Consider how differently people react to someone who apologizes for existing compared with someone who acknowledges mistakes without shrinking themselves. Both may be equally humble. Yet one communicates insecurity, while the other communicates accountability. Accountability accepts responsibility. Insecurity assumes responsibility for everything. The difference is profound. Many people carry an unconscious habit of over-explaining. They justify simple decisions that require no defense. I know you're probably upset. I hope this isn't a problem. I'm sorry, but these phrases become automatic. They are intended to preserve harmony. Ironically, when overused, they often communicate uncertainty where none was necessary. Language shapes perception. Not because individual words possess magical power, but because repeated language reveals repeated thinking. People eventually notice the pattern. A person who constantly asks permission for ordinary decisions gradually teaches others that permission is required. Someone who respectfully communicates decisions without unnecessary justification sends a different signal. They acknowledge others without surrendering ownership of their choices. There is another subtle force that influences value: emotional predictability under pressure. Pressure magnifies patterns. Anyone can appear composed when circumstances are favorable. The moments that reshape reputation are usually inconvenient. Plans change unexpectedly. Criticism arrives without warning. Opportunities disappear. Misunderstandings spread. During those moments, observers pay close attention. Not because they are hoping you fail, because pressure reveals priorities. Some individuals become reactive. Others become reflective. Some immediately search for blame. Others search for information. Neither response guarantees success. But over time, one creates greater trust than the other. People remember how you handle uncertainty because uncertainty is emotionally contagious. A calm presence does not eliminate difficulty. It prevents unnecessary difficulty from multiplying. That quality is uncommon. Anything uncommon naturally attracts attention. One reason emotionally disciplined people are respected is that they reduce noise. They do not react to every opinion, every rumor, every slight, or every invitation to compete. They choose carefully where to invest attention. Attention is a resource. Every resource becomes more valuable when allocated intentionally. Imagine carrying a container filled with water through a crowded place. Every unnecessary movement spills a little more. By the time you reach your destination, very little remains. Attention functions similarly. Every argument entered without purpose. Every criticism absorbed without evaluation. Every distraction accepted without question. Each one quietly drains the mental energy available for meaningful work. People often believe they need more motivation. Sometimes they simply need fewer unnecessary demands competing for the same attention. This is why selective engagement is so powerful. You do not have to respond to every challenge to demonstrate strength. In many cases, refusing an unproductive conflict demonstrates greater strength than winning it. Not every invitation deserves acceptance. Not every accusation deserves an answer. Not every misunderstanding deserves correction. Discernment means recognizing the difference. One of the strongest indicators of self-respect is the ability to tolerate being misunderstood by people who are unwilling to understand. That sentence deserves careful thought. There is an important distinction between clarification and persuasion. Clarification is offered to those who are genuinely seeking understanding. Persuasion becomes endless when directed toward people committed to misunderstanding. The first creates connection. The second creates exhaustion. Many individuals lose enormous amounts of emotional energy attempting to change minds that were never open in the first place. Energy invested without possibility of return eventually becomes depletion. Instead, emotionally mature people focus on consistency. They understand that reputation is not built through one perfect explanation. It is built through hundreds of ordinary interactions that slowly eliminate doubt. Someone may question your intentions today. If your behavior remains consistent for years, the question often answers itself. Time has extraordinary persuasive power. Not because time changes everyone, because sustained consistency is difficult to counterfeit. Anyone can perform confidence for an afternoon. Anyone can rehearse charisma for an interview. Maintaining integrity through changing circumstances requires something deeper than empaths. Performance. It requires identity. Identity determines behavior when no immediate reward exists. That is where genuine value is formed. Not in dramatic declarations. Not in public recognition. In the quiet decisions made repeatedly when convenience points one direction and principle points another. Eventually, people stop measuring you by isolated achievements. They begin measuring you by reliability. Can this person be trusted with responsibility? Do they remain steady under pressure? Do they keep commitments when circumstances become inconvenient? Do they treat people with respect even when there is nothing to gain? These questions rarely appear in conversation. They are answered silently through observation. And once those answers become clear, respect begins to feel less like something granted by others, and more like the natural consequence of a life lived with deliberate standards. One of the most revealing moments in any relationship occurs when you stop giving people more than they have come to expect. You do not become rude. You do not become distant. You simply stop exceeding the invisible contract that only one person knew existed. The reaction is often immediate. Someone who rarely thanked you suddenly notices what is missing. Someone who took your availability for granted suddenly asks why you have changed. Someone who never questioned your schedule suddenly becomes concerned about your priorities. Nothing actually changed except the direction of your energy. That shift exposes expectations that had been hidden beneath routine. Human beings adapt quickly to repeated benefits. What begins as appreciation often becomes expectation, and expectation quietly becomes entitlement when it is never interrupted. This process is rarely malicious. It is simply how the mind conserves effort. Once a pattern appears reliable, the brain stops evaluating it with the same level of attention. That is why gratitude requires intention. Without intention, familiarity slowly replaces appreciation. Consider the difference between earning something and inheriting it. What is earned tends to be protected, because effort creates psychological investment. What is inherited without effort can sometimes be overlooked, because the emotional cost of obtaining it was never experienced. Attention works the same way. If your attention is always available, people stop noticing its value. If your approval is guaranteed, they stop appreciating it. If your forgiveness arrives before accountability, they may never confront the behavior that required forgiveness in the first place. This is not about withholding kindness. It is about refusing to make your kindness so predictable that it becomes invisible. There is an interesting paradox in human behavior. Most people say they admire honesty, discipline, confidence, and integrity. Yet these qualities often create quiet discomfort because they establish an unspoken comparison. Comparison is emotionally powerful. It does not require competition. Simply observing another person's consistency can cause someone to evaluate their own inconsistency. That evaluation creates tension. Some people use that tension as motivation. Others attempt to reduce it by changing how they interpret the person creating it. If improving themselves feels difficult, lowering their opinion of you becomes psychologically easier. This explains why criticism sometimes increases as your standards become clearer. The criticism is not always directed at your behavior. Sometimes it is directed at what your behavior represents. Standards have a way of making compromises more visible. The person who regularly arrives prepared unintentionally highlights those who do not. The person who remains composed during conflict unintentionally highlights emotional impulsiveness. The person who keeps promises unintentionally highlights broken commitments. No words are required. Behavior alone creates the comparison. This is why emotionally secure individuals rarely spend energy trying to appear impressive. They understand that genuine influence comes from reducing the gap between what they believe and how they behave. Consistency becomes credibility. Credibility becomes trust. Trust becomes quiet authority. Authority built in this way does not depend on titles or popularity. It depends on predictability. People know what to expect because your principles remain stable across changing. Stability is deeply attractive, not because it is exciting, because it reduces uncertainty. The human brain constantly evaluates risk. Every interaction includes subtle predictions about what might happen next. Will this person overreact? Will they keep their word? Will they disappear when things become inconvenient? Will they change depending on who is watching? Each consistent action answers those questions. Eventually, people stop asking. They already know. That certainty becomes part of your reputation. Another habit that quietly reduces perceived value is seeking immediate validation for every decision. Before taking action, many people look around emotionally, searching for agreement. They announce plans before committing to them. They ask for approval before trusting their own judgment. They measure confidence by the reactions of others. This creates dependence. When confidence depends on external agreement, disagreement feels like a threat instead of information. Emotionally grounded people approach disagreement differently. They listen carefully, they evaluate the facts. If new evidence appears, they adjust. If not, they continue without unnecessary defensiveness. Flexibility and insecurity are not the same thing. Changing your mind because you learned something new reflects strength. Changing your mind because you fear disapproval reflects uncertainty. Observers recognize that distinction over time. Another overlooked element of value is emotional pacing. Some people reveal everything immediately. Every goal, every fear, every frustration, every success. While openness can strengthen relationships, constant emotional exposure often removes the natural rhythm that allows trust to develop gradually. Trust grows in layers. It is built through repeated experiences of honesty, reliability, and mutual respect. When every layer is skipped, intimacy can feel rushed rather than earned. The strongest relationships usually develop through shared experiences, not accelerated disclosure. Patience communicates confidence. Urgency often communicates fear of losing connection. This principle extends into nearly every area of life. Professionally, personally, and socially, people tend to respect those who allow value to reveal itself through time rather than demanding immediate recognition. Time filters exaggeration. It also confirms authenticity. Anyone can describe themselves as disciplined. Years of consistent behavior make the description unnecessary. Anyone can claim confidence. Calm decisions during uncertain moments provide stronger evidence. Anyone can announce high standards. The standards become believable only when they remain intact under pressure. That is why long-term credibility is difficult to imitate. Performance eventually becomes exhausting. Identity remains consistent because it requires far less effort to maintain. The goal, then, is not to appear valuable. The goal is to build habits that naturally produce value, even when no one is watching. Because eventually, someone is watching. Not during the moments you planned. During the ordinary moments you assumed would never matter. Those moments accumulate. And accumulation is what shapes the way people eventually decide how much respect, trust, and responsibility they are willing to place in your hands.